as you perhaps heard in the last couple of sessions, if you were here, or even if you're not here, look what's happening in the world, right? Is technology disrupting, creating new industries, geopolitics, reshuffling footprints. Clearly, customer demands are changing. You have AI, just and climate change as well. The whole set of pressures on industries as they think about the next couple of decades. So that's what our next panel is going to be about. I want to actually introduce Sven Thermani, who's an alum from here. You heard Paul mention him earlier. Sven's a senior partner at EY and brings a lot of energy. He actually runs the energy and industrial practice. I must say, and Sven will mention that, we were going to have the Siemens Energy CEO, but his flight got canceled from Miami, so he's not here. So we have 3 industries here: energy, automotive, and food. And with that, Sven, on to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anil. And thank you for the great opportunity to have a panel here. And for the audience, it's been fun hearing the questions. So we have Carolyn from Pepsi, and we have Stephen from DENSO. And so maybe I'll invite you to do a little introduction about yourself and your company before we dive into our discussion.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really honored to have a chance to participate in this panel. So about myself, Caroline Berson from PepsiCo, based in Washington, D.C., essentially represent our international business to stakeholders in and transiting through Washington. Been at the company for 7 years now. My experience prior to PepsiCo sat at the intersection of economic and national security. I came most recently from the White House, where I was part of both the National Security Council and the National Economic Council, and prior to that, spent time in both the intelligence community and at the Treasury Department. I will also introduce PepsiCo a little bit. I feel like it's one of those companies that people are so familiar with, but are also always surprised by. So a couple of things that I'll share. First, we are the largest food and beverage company in North America, the second largest in the world, right behind Nestle. We sell more food than we do drinks, which always surprises people. We source 35 different crops from over 60 countries. We operate 1,000 global manufacturing sites, including more than 290 that we as a company own. And we produce food and drinks that are consumed by over 1 billion times daily. So obviously, really large scale, engaged across the full spectrum of the food and beverage value chain. And again, really excited to be part of today's conversation.
Then, I'm Steve Milam, and I'm from DENSO. And we were joking in back that she's from Pepsi, but most people don't really know fully what Pepsi does. I'm from DENSO, and probably 90% of you in the room have our products, but probably 1 or 2 of you in the room know who we are. We're about a $50 billion automotive supplier, and so fairly large tier 1. There's a reference earlier about Nippon Steel. We were originally Nippon DENSO. We're a Japanese company. We eventually dropped the Nippon part many decades ago and just became DENSO. Prior to being at DENSO, I was one of the major OEMs for a number of years and joined DENSO really looking at cash burn. If you think about the Detroit 3 and the mid-2000s and their cash burn, I decided that I would jump out for a while and probably go back after around 2009 was when I thought it might be safe to go back. And I decided, I'm really enjoying DENSO and what they stand for, so I stayed. Been there about 18 years now. We have 2 main missions. One is green and one peace of mind. Peace of mind is really, probably green self-explanatory, but peace of mind is really about bringing safety to automotive in a way that it has not been there before and making a world of 0 traffic accidents. Products that we put into that category is basically all the brains of the car, all the sensors, the computers, the radars, the cameras, everything like that. And then in the green space, we do everything from ICE powertrain parts, which probably sets up part of the discussion today. We also are very heavy in electrification and have been from the beginning of the resurgence of electrification in automotive. And then we also have all sorts of things in between, cabin comfort and such as that. So quite a wide array of products. And then last thing about us, we invented the QR code. So we invented that, we gave it to society. We wanted to use it because we wanted to put more data in. And if we were going to use it and get benefit, everybody else needed to use it too. So we gave that to society about 25 years ago. So.
Right
Georgetown's
there.
using it, yeah.
Yep,
Right there.
it's everywhere. Can you imagine if we had charged, half a penny for every time somebody scanned one of those? So.
So pulling on the thread of green, sustainability is a huge focus globally. So maybe talk a little bit, maybe we can start with you, Stephen. What are the key transformations that you're seeing in the industry towards sustainability? What are some of the challenges, and how's the industry addressing that?
Yeah, it's a great question, very timely, and quite a struggle. DENSO first made an electric car, even though we're not a OEM maker. We first made an electric car in 1949 just to show the demonstration and ability of an electric car. Naturally, that was a little bit early for the market, but now the timing is certainly there. And really, a lot of the struggle comes down to getting the technology ready in time. There's a lot of discussion right now about maybe a slowdown in demand or a decline in BEV, and I don't think it quite characterizes. I think that what is happening is, as a reality, once a person drives an electric car, they love the experience of driving an electric car. If you've not driven one, give it a shot sometime. They are absolutely amazing and fun to drive. And they have so many positive sides. The difficulty that we have is that if you think about new product introduction curves and how we get from the early adopters, where people are willing to make as few sacrifices that are significant but manageable to their lives, and get to the early majority. And really, there's been a big push for that, a little bit premature to where the technology was actually at. And that means that as a reality, no matter what legislation anybody wants to pass, consumers weren't willing to make the sacrifice that is needed at the current level. But that's just the issue to be solved, where we can back up and then really work through the technology. It's not very far into the horizon when you look into the future of where the technology is emerging, but we need to get charging times down, and we need to get range up. And the very leading edge cars that are out there are where we need to be. So certainly within the next 5 years, I think we're going to see a completely different place. But there's several factors that have to go with that we'll probably talk as we go. We've got the interest in regulations towards BEV before the technology, but we also have it before we've opened up the access to the raw materials that are necessary to realize it, and then the infrastructure that goes with it. These are not in synchronization yet. So even if we solve the car portion, we still have many, many obstacles in order to really realize it and bring the benefits. So I think some of the later questions will take us there more.
Yep, great. What about sustainability in food? That's a big focus too.
Absolutely, it's intractable, in fact. So climate change, is impacting every industry. The food system space is no different. Within PepsiCo, we've adopted a business philosophy, an internal initiative that we call PepsiCo Positive, or Pep Positive. And it's something that really looks to put sustainability and social impact at the center of how we make, move, and sell our products. And it's something that I've really appreciated. It launched after I arrived at PepsiCo, but the way we approach sustainability being part of our business is something I've really appreciated having the opportunity to experience and see firsthand. Coming from government, I felt like it was very easy to be skeptical of companies when they put these types of initiatives forward. And I was listening in the previous panel, and there was a reference to ESG not even being a topic of conversation anymore because it's just so intrinsically linked into everything that companies are thinking about across their value chain. And so it's been kind of personally fulfilling to go on this experience of moving from the kind of philosophy of something that sounds like a good idea to fully internalizing and experiencing what it means for a company like PepsiCo. But PepsiCo's not unique. It's every company in the food space is thinking this way, operating this way. So for us, as we look across climate change and how we look to adapt and mitigate some of the impacts, we are looking at manufacturing, agriculture, packaging, transportation, vending and cooling equipment. Again, it's really across the full value chain. I thought it could be interesting to explore the idea of water a little bit in this conversation, not least because it's sitting in front of us, but also because it is, and this sounds very trite, but it is essential for human life. It is something that we cannot live without. It's indispensable to every community, every ecosystem, and every economy. But there's also this growing appreciation for the fact that there is intense pressure on water systems, not just in water-stressed areas, but across the globe. And it's being exacerbated by climate change, by drought, by water pollution, by growing demand. And one of the things that's been really interesting to see about how PepsiCo, just as an example, has approached some of these issues is really looking at making thoughtful changes to things that sound small, but have this really big and really profound impact. So some of the ways that we're adopting sustainability approaches within our company, looking at this water lens, include everything from looking at how we're washing the corn that we use in our products. And the risk of going down the Forrest Gump listing out of our products, but this includes Doritos, Fritos, Cheetos, the O's, that are beloved by people around the world. But by making this change, we've been able to create a system where we're looking to be able to save something in the realm of 650 million liters of water per year. We are looking at creating more of a circular structure for reuse within our manufacturing facilities. And that's kind of manifesting in two ways. One, just by looking at kind of waste runoff from our general products and looking at general production streams and looking at how we can treat that water and bring it back into municipal processes. But on the other side of things, and this is one of my favorite examples, but potatoes are something in the realm of 80% water. And so one of the things that we've been looking at as a company is how we can take the vapor that comes off of potatoes as you're cooking them to turn, again, back into water that we can use in our manufacturing processes. So we're looking at capturing that vapor and using it to create this circularity and to support our manufacturing processes. So it's really exciting to see some of those innovations come to life, and I think that those examples are exactly at the heart of what I was describing at the beginning, in the sense of how companies are not just kind of thinking about this as tack-on ideas, but are really looking at sustainability initiatives as ones that can dock into and affect change across every part of the way we operate as a company. And this idea of partnerships is also really important as well. And so when we look at, again, going back to this the area of water, when we look at how we approach conservation and water systems in local communities, it's important to be hyper-local. And so that involves working with local NGOs, local community players, local governments, to really understand the challenges that a community is facing and how we can bring hyper-local solutions to bear that provide the greatest kind of effective impact.
Great, thank you for that insight. Maybe Joe, Stephen, one follow-up question for you. Especially when we look at mobility, because of the challenges you mentioned, how are corporations managing through decisions that are more sustainable, but may not have as positive of an impact on P&L? Because that's a big issue, right?
Yeah.
Because it's easy to make decisions which are more sustainable when they have a positive impact on the bottom line. But given the changes in the pace of adoption, so maybe shed some insight on that, please.
Yeah, that's a very difficult situation, naturally. One of the characteristics, though, of companies that really survive a long time is that they also think a long time into the future. And so we don't talk about maximizing shareholder value, for example. I've never heard that expression in my company, and I think you hear it less and less. What we talk about is a sustainable business, and sustainable business comes by many, many dimensions. So we are going through a process to make our plants carbon neutral. Nobody's ever going to pay us more money because our plants are carbon neutral or not. So we can't spend exorbitant amounts, but it's very important to do nevertheless from the perspective of just contributing to society as a good global member. So really, at the end of the day, you all have to set a budget of how much you can spend in this area. And so we are going through and we're putting solar into quite a lot of our plants. We're participating in a green tariff. We've committed carbon neutrality by 2025 with credits, and by 2035 globally without credits. But it's the issue with the climate is a global problem, so there's not going to be a no-cost way out of it. But it has to go in with all of your other calculations, and just say what's manageable right now. And so we have targets every single year how much we're going to drop. We didn't start it in the last few years. We've had a eco-vision for decades now, and so every year we are making significant incremental improvement with carbon neutrality and 2 different milestones there. I can't give you a perfect formula. It's not possible. It's just a matter of having to be the kind of company that wants to be sustainable, not just from an environmental point of view, but by every dimension. And so you can't make it 100% about the environment, but if the environment's not part of it, you don't have a future. So it's just a delicate balancing act. So.
Yep. Great. Thank you. We've heard a lot today about geopolitics and the uncertainty that's creating. On the other hand, we have demand that's shifting rapidly, right? The trends are changing, and finally, the global logistics, as Ricardo, you'd say, used to be very smooth. It's no longer smooth. The Suez Canal is not very usable right now. The Panama Canal has a shortage of water. So the global supply chains are highly disrupted, and both of your businesses are extremely global. The industries are extremely global. So talk a little bit about how you're seeing transformations that create resiliency in your industry while responding to much more dynamic demand and geopolitical environment.
Right. So if I go to the post-COVID supply chain crisis, when we look at that one, the reality is you're not going to get through that based on something you do in that moment. You're going to get through that based on what you've done the prior 5, 10, 15 years. Because in what happened after COVID, that was all a demand problem, but every link in your supply chain gets to make a decision who they're going to prioritize. And they'll prioritize based on those prior 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So we had nowhere near the difficulty that others had because we work with such a long-term balanced perspective. That's what makes a successful business. I've done handshake deals when a supplier was suddenly closing, and I moved millions of dollars of business to the only other North American company that could produce it, and all my competitors came begging afterwards for that capacity. I took all the remaining capacity in North America. It was a handshake, actually a Saturday phone call. And this company people were throwing millions at him, but he already had a verbal commitment. And because we operate in that way and with that degree of trust, then the first step in the last supply chain crisis was much smoother for us because we didn't have anywhere near the difficulty in the relationships. We had personal phone numbers. We could call anybody anytime, and based on the history, they'd support. That meant that we actually ended up having customers invent awards. In automotive, you get OEMs give awards every year. They started inventing awards for us specifically because of how smoothly we went through the supply chain crisis. So the very first thing, it's really simple. It's just how you treat people. It's, do you hammer them for supply? Do you call up and yell at them? Or do you call them up and say, what do you need? We had, during that crisis, if you remember the winter storms in Texas, we had a chemical supplier that lost their plant for several weeks. They told us late in the process, you're the only customer that did not hammer us once. We were on daily phone calls with their executives. They said, we're the only company that said, hey, how are your people doing? How are you doing? Can you sleep? Do you need resources? Do you need skilled trades? We can send skilled trades to you. So when you go through with that type of, let's just treat everybody as a human, then a lot of these resiliency issues come down. Now, that doesn't mean that we slept easily, and doesn't mean that we didn't take lessons learned, but we didn't have near the problems that other companies had. Now, beyond that, we are upgrading software to map the supply chain. We do recognize that semiconductors are outside of our core industry of automotive. So we invested $500 million into a particular type of semiconductor company that has the types of chips that you need for electrification in the future, and took a 12.5% stake. That gives us, again, longer-term relationship. It shows our commitment to them to make sure that we have supply. That being said, we have an awful lot more people now than we used to, looking at every time there's a union crisis for the ports, every time there's bad storms. We have a lot more daily activity on that. It went from being something that you do from time to time to where it's become the core job of a lot of people. And I'm not sure when it will settle down again, but yeah, I even get calls today on what's happening with Florida, of course. So we have a lot more resources there, but at the end of the day, it really comes back, most of it comes down, you're not in business alone, and how do you treat the people that you're in business with, and what kind of relationships and bonds and trust can you have? And those relationships are what's going to take you through to the end, more than any other thing that you can put in there by technology or whatever else.
Wonderful. And I love that concept of, and it's not a concept, it's a reality of putting relationships at the forefront. That's really powerful and fantastic. Going back to something you mentioned earlier, this idea of you can't approach resiliency in the moment. You have to approach it on the 5-year, 10-year back time horizon. And also reflecting on the panel before this, where one of the gentlemen was talking about the importance of operating locally, and that's absolutely at the forefront of how PepsiCo manages its operations. So we are in 200 countries and territories around the world, and not only does operating locally make sense from a resiliency perspective, which I'll come to in a moment, but it also makes sense in the food industry overall. I mean, beverages are very heavy. It's very complex to move them around the world, and consumers want local flavors, local textures, kind of that local relevancy and personality of the foods that they're consuming. One of my favorite things is traveling around the world and trying the different flavors, obviously Frito-Lay products and things like that, but it's amazing to see the local spins that are on so many of our different products, and how, again, they're embedded into the fabric of communities. So we operate because, locally, because it makes sense in that perspective, but also because, exactly to the point that you were making and that the colleagues prior to this were making, it obviously allows us to be much more resilient when there are shocks to the system. And so, in addition to the supply chain disruptions that you were describing, obviously COVID, which you touched on, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impact that had on global grain markets, overall navigating the impacts of climate change and the disruptions that it has on transportation costs, logistics. Something that we're also very closely looking at are the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea and how that's increasing shipping costs and timing and everything like that. And so, again, being hyper-local is important to us as a company because that's how people experience our foods, but it's also very helpful in the face of resiliency. A couple of other things I'll mention in that resiliency space. So we also work very closely with our farming partners to help them kind of embed different types of technology and practices into their business that allow them to better anticipate and react to different types of shocks in the moment. One of the projects there that I'm particularly proud of is an initiative we have in Iraq, of all places, with potato farmers there, together with the World Food Program, to not only help those farmers become stronger and more resilient in the face of climate change, but also conflict-driven instability and just making sure that their supply chain is as resilient as possible. And then kind of in the space of transportation, another surprising fact about PepsiCo is that we have one of the largest private trucking fleets in the US. We own and operate a lot of our own vehicles in the US and many other markets where we operate. And so something that we focus on as a company, kind of in the space of, for a number of different reasons, but to increase resiliency, we've been acquiring electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, natural gas-driven vehicles, and also thinking about how we can leverage digital tools to make our transportation more interconnected, safer, more reliable. So that's been really empowering and impactful. So there's kind of that operational side. And then I also think it's important to talk a little bit about the policy enablers that allow for some of this kind of resiliency and the planning now for the 5, 10, 15 years down the line. And so in that policy space, two things I'll mention. One, in the world of electric vehicles, we've been very actively engaged as a company in helping governments think through the infrastructure that needs to be put into place to allow both short and long haul trucks to be able to leverage that type of technology. And something else that I'm particularly engaged in and excited about, when you look at the continent of Africa, I know there's some conversations about the Global South earlier, but Africa has 60% of the world's remaining arable land, and so is obviously deeply tied into the future of food security and food systems. And we're also seeing massive shifts in demographics over the next century. It's something I spend a lot of time thinking about, but someone today put into very stark contrast a very relevant statistic for the point I'm trying to make, which is that by the end of the century, Nigeria will be more populous than China. Just really kind of impressive to think about. And so the development of the agriculture sector in Africa is important on so many different levels. And while it's currently dominated by smallholder and subsistence farmers, there are a lot of things that we can do to make that food system much more resilient and prepared for the future. And so one of the areas in particular that we're thinking about is how things like the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCAFTA, can help empower not just intracontinental trade, but also the potential for the continent to export and be kind of a future breadbasket for the world. And so by thinking about the policies that can be put in place now, those public-private partnerships that can enable implementation, there's a lot of excitement around what we can kind of do in the future. Great,
wonderful. Talking a little bit about resiliency in energy, some of the key trends we are seeing is having redundancy, a little bit of redundancy, and also think about energy plants, right? Think about solar plants or windmills, and what we're starting to see globally is used to be a world of just-in-time inventory, and everything worked like clockwork. So what we're starting to see, and I'm sure you're seeing this too, is we are starting to pivot back a little bit into we need to have sufficient buffers throughout the value chain so that I don't have like a plant down, a power plant down, or I don't have a windmill not working for weeks because I can't get a bearing. So we're starting to see shift in global policies around how do you run your value chains and starting to think of absorbing shocks along the way versus I'll say 10 years ago, pre-Brexit, I think somebody mentioned Brexit, that was sort of the first event that triggered change in global trade. Also, looking at second use of batteries. So think of solar farms or wind farms, they don't create energy at a stable level. So what do I do when I don't have sufficient energy? So second life for batteries is a great use because they can still store energy for a short period of time, 12 hours, 14 hours, 24 hours, and put that back into the grid. So as you have change in wind or production of solar changes because of clouds, you still have stable energy output because the grid needs that. The other thing we are starting to see also is different use of interconnects and ability of companies like Xcel Energy to take a solar farm and plug it into their existing carbon based plant. So because the permitting of interconnects is one of the biggest bottlenecks in the industry. So instead of waiting 3 years to get the permit, you can take a solar farm and plug it into an existing thermal power plant. So now you're able to create sustainable energy, green energy much faster, rather than waiting in line 3 years for permits. So those are some of the things we are seeing in the energy industry, and certainly, as we move towards electrification, we're going to need a lot more electricity, right? So, how do you create power which is sustainable and green? Because otherwise, you're just shifting emissions from the tailpipe, to the power plant. So, this also brings up technology and innovation. Everybody's now using Gen AI. It's on my phone. I ask Google a question. The AI generates and compiles the answer. I didn't check how many times global business was mentioned, but you can pretty much ask any question to Google or use a co-pilot, right? So let's talk a little bit about technology and innovation and how that's accelerating transformation in the business. And maybe a very short part on, what could regulatory environment do to help, or how is it hurting today? So maybe we start with you.
Wonderful, thank you. So I am so excited by the idea of AI. It's a little scary as well, in all honesty, but it's really exciting to see what a company like PepsiCo and what an industry like the food industry can do with this type of technology. And so we're seeing it being adopted across, the full spectrum of our value chain. And it's everything from, we had a conference earlier this year where our communications experts were thinking through how you can use co-pilot to encourage creativity, not fear it from a stifling perspective, to how we can upskill our employees and kind of empower different career progressions and harness new technologies to make jobs easier and careers even better. But we're also embedding AI across every facet of our business. So everything from how our farming partners are using data to better predict growing seasons, when to use different types of fertilizers, different types of seeds, and to ensure that they're again, able to deliver really improved productivity and yields through the use of AI optimization. Across logistics, with AI-powered systems, we can now kind of intuit, if you will. We can sense when a vehicle is about to have an issue, and we can preemptively fix that and get the truck back on the road and the driver back in, on their route and in their jobs. And that was something I had a chance to do what we call a ride-along with one of our drivers a couple of months ago, and it was really interesting to see kind of in this kind of single-person moment how AI was transforming the approach that he took to his routes, for example. Our sales teams are also embedding AI into the way they're doing business as well. I was in Brazil earlier this year, and some of our sales team was showing us kind of the app on their phone and how they're able to use AI, again, in a predictive way to think about, weather, different events coming down the pike, and kind of harness also the creativity of e-commerce in really interesting ways. When we look at regulation in this space, we are encouraging it. I think it's, especially in DC circles, it's so easy to kind of fear the decoupling of AI and the kind of the ability without a system in place for malactors to take advantage of the system. And so regulation is something that we're supportive of, we're actively participating in conversations around, and really hoping we can have as something that levels the playing field and is a workable solution for all. Something that we look at as for ourselves and as our participation in these conversations is that oftentimes AI conversations, technology conversations are not surprisingly dominated by the technology companies that are so existentially linked into those discussions. But as an end user, we really want to make sure that that perspective is captured in the conversations as well. So we are active participants in helping different governments, including in the US, think through the best approach there. But pro-regulation is the bottom line.
Yeah. Thank you. I think probably you covered AI pretty well. A lot of those same items go on in automotive if we think about how we operate internally or how we operate with our supply chain. So probably I'd like to segue to more the development of the technologies that we're trying to use to change for the environment or improve safety. There's been an awful lot that you've seen in the automotive industry the last few years that looked like this incredibly exciting development, and then it sort of petered away. Right? Like everybody was talking about, obviously, autonomous drive and car sharing and ride sharing, and all of that is much smaller than anybody thought it would be by this phase. Almost anybody thought it would be. And so sometimes I think we put a little bit too much euphoria and miss the big obstacles that face. So if we step back and we go then to green, I mentioned earlier about the sort of interplay between the consumer readiness and willingness to sacrifice of where they are in that product development curve, the technology readiness, and then the regulation between them. In order to get, I'll start with technology readiness. In order to get there, it's quite a big challenge. But when we think about a global company, we're all global citizens, right? I work at a company that's not an American company. We can put anything anywhere. And how the countries compete, that we do the innovation in their country as opposed to another, is really growing. And if we think about what's happened in the East, there's been a huge acceleration from the government in terms of encouraging innovation. And in the West, we aren't encouraging that same degree of innovation. Our tax laws, for example, we can't even deduct R&D expenses in the year that it occurs. Meanwhile, some countries are allowing 200% deduction of R&D. That takes billions out of R&D. So if we really want to do things like solve the climate crisis, how we create an environment that's favorable for pure innovation to be taking place with speed is really extremely important. In my company alone, it costs us many tens of millions of dollars a year more for every dollar of R&D that we spend here. It all piles up to tens of millions of dollars more than if we do it in another country. And this is becoming, I think, maybe a growing issue in terms of how countries compete. We are a very innovative country, but we aren't always incentivizing that innovation take place here. So that's probably one of the very, very big ones right there. Yep. And then the regulation. When we put the regulation that says implement this technology by this date, but we put the thumb on the scale to a particular solution, then that means that we need to put our thumb on the scale for everything that goes with that. This is where I think we may be getting stuck in the U.S. is that we want to incentivize the electrification of the car, but we are not changing the permitting laws to get access to the raw materials that are necessary to do that. And if we don't have the raw materials, then maybe, reality, you can do a lot more for the environment with hybrid cars. But hybrid cars isn't where the thumb got pushed.
Right.
So how we balance all this out to get the goal that we all want, right? Everybody wants the same thing. Everybody wants green energy. They want green transportation. Everybody wants that. But our regulations are a bit imbalanced. So how we take a step back in order to kind of equalize that, I think would be quite a huge step in actually achieving the goal that we have.
Thank you, Stephen.